Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the second of our double bill today. If you didn't catch the earlier show about the Maginot Line with Kevin Passmore, I definitely recommend you go and find that later on. But right now, we are returning to our series of presentations drawn from the German-Soviet War book edited by Jeff Rutherford. Nicolas Virtue joins us to look at the Italian involvement in the offensives into the Soviet Union, politics, ideology, and logistics. And of course, the links to purchasing the book are in the description below, or you can find it at your favorite bookstore. Welcome to the show, Nicolas. How are you today, sir?
I'm very good. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Paul. I'm delighted to be here.
So first question I've been asking most of the people who are part of Jeff's entourage, his chapter writers, is how do you get involved in the project? And were there negotiations over what you were going to cover and which aspect? Because like all of his guests, there's lots of different ways you can go with this. So what was the story?
Yeah, well, I'm an assistant professor in history at King's University College in London, Ontario, Canada, the other London. But my interest in this project actually goes back long before I started working at King's. It goes back to a third-year undergraduate essay that I wrote. That's what really got me interested in looking at what the Italians were doing on the Eastern Front, and that ended up turning into a master's thesis that I wrote at the University of Calgary. After that, I went on to look at different theaters of Italian occupation in Yugoslavia and Ethiopia for my PhD work. And during which course I met Jeff Rutherford, one of the editors of this volume, at a conference in Barcelona, I think it was originally.
Oh, cool.
And then again at a workshop that the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum was putting on, the same one that I think Maier McCulloch-Rowe mentioned the other day. And so, we got talking about this previous work I had done on the Eastern Front, and he mentions that they're working on this book and they could really use something from the Italian point of view. So it was presented me with a great opportunity to kind of go back, revisit this master's thesis, bring in some new archival evidence, and kind of update the historiography. So it's been a long time in the making, but finally here it is, chapter 5 in the book, The German-Soviet War.
Well, brilliant. We're glad to have you, and I'll hand it over to you. And as we were just discussing before going live there, it seems that it's a broad sweeping statement. Italy as a country hasn't looked back as much into its past and its World War II involvement as other countries. The UK famously, books on World War II coming out on a daily basis, filling up the bookshelves of the bookstores and festivals and conferences and war films. Italy maybe is looking a little bit more forwards and not looking back on the past, and yet it is, they are a major part of the Axis. They are in most theaters of World War II, and yet we do seem to some extent overlook their participation. So I'm looking forward to learning more with you. So I'm going to hand it over to you folks. Fire away with comments and questions if you want to, but I'm going to hand over to Nick to take us through this. So over to you, sir.
Sure. So yeah, I've got an image of the book cover here. Again, just to talk a little bit more about the book itself, I was really pleased with the way it turned out. It's a fantastic collection, number of first-rate contributions, as you've seen from the other speakers that you've had in the last few weeks, including several on, even though it's called the German-Soviet War, right? There's actually several on non-German, non-Soviet actors. So you've heard about the Romanians. I think tomorrow you're hearing about the Luxembourg,
Luxembourg, tomorrow, from Vienna.
And you've heard about the Poles fighting on the sides of the Soviets, I think. So my contribution was about focusing on fascist Italy and its relationship to the Vernichtungskrieg, another kind of theme that this book, that the volume really focused on, right? The Vernichtungskrieg, Hitler's war of annihilation, war of extermination on the Eastern Front. So looking at how the Italians slotted into that and sort of exploring their relationship with the Vernichtungskrieg, focusing on the first year of the campaign. 1941, 1942, so the first year of the Barbarossa campaign. And one of the reasons that I wanted to kind of focus on that first year was, I mean, it's a formative year for the Vernichtungskrieg as a whole. Much of the German scholarship is focused on that year. It also allowed me to still provide a fairly broad overview, like this is kind of a survey chapter, but it allows me to just narrow it and still, you know, produce kind of a 25-page chapter out of it. But also it's driven by the state of memory on this campaign. Often it's forgotten that the Italians were present during that first year of the campaign in the East. But indeed, there was, you know, by the end of August, you had an expeditionary corps of some 60,000 men that had reached the Eastern Front. And on this map here, I've tried to highlight kind of the areas in which the Italians were operational in 1941. They reached the front, as I say, kind of at the end of August, and they immediately participate in operations around Dnipropetrovsk, and work their way east, advancing towards Donetsk and the Donets basin. Donetsk is labeled Stalino on this map. That's what it was referred to at the time. They then fight a series of fairly major battles outside of Donetsk before settling in for a quiet, lengthy occupation that takes them through spring of 1942. This is a map of the ongoing present-day Donetsk front in the Ukraine-Russia war, but I thought it might be a useful way just to envision where the Italians actually were during this period of occupation. So you can see in the center of the map there the industrial city of Donetsk, again, yep. Stalino at the time. That was kind of the logistics hub for the Italians. They didn't administer Donetsk. It was German administered, but it was kind of this shared logistical hub between the Germans and the Italians. The Italian Expeditionary Corps headquarters was not too far east of Avdiivka, which you also see on the map. And their front line stretched from Horlivka to Shakhtarsk, and I added Shakhtarsk into the map there. So you get the sense that the Italians were occupying a sector of the front that now kind of falls fully within the Russian-occupied part of Ukraine, and most of it, almost all of it, has been occupied actually since 2014. So this is, and you kind of get a sense even from the map today, right? This is actually a fairly sizable, densely populated area that the Italians, that this relatively small Italian expeditionary corps was occupying. But this experience of occupation in 1941-42 in the Donbass has, as I say, kind of largely been forgotten, or it's been neglected, I think, in Italy and abroad, in part because if there is any memory of Italy's war on the Eastern Front, it tends to focus on the second year of the war in the East. In particular, the Battle of Stalingrad, which is an absolute catastrophe for the Italian forces, which by that point in the 1942-43 campaign, this expeditionary corps has been upgraded to an entire army of more than 200,000 men. The Italian 8th Army ends up guarding, you know, kind of the north flank of Stalingrad along the Don River. And they are struck hard by the Red Army's winter offensive. some, I think 95,000 Italian soldiers are killed and missing in the battle. Most of them probably taken prisoner, but only 10,000 of those Italian POWs are going to return to Italy after the war. Some not until the 1950s. So this tends to be the way that the Eastern Front is remembered in Italy, and I'd say outside of Italy as well. If you're thinking of it in terms of what the Italian experience on the Eastern Front tends to be seen through this lens of Stalingrad, the retreat from these positions on the Don River, famous images like the one we're seeing here, right, which are showing these Italians who have now been, they've been cut off, and they're trying to escape this pocket that they find themselves in. And it's in like minus 47-degree conditions, and it doesn't end very well. So these photographs like this are reinforced by extensive memoir literature that Italians publish. So it's not that the Eastern Front has been completely neglected or ignored, but it really is very selective memory.
And slightly romanticized as well?
Romanticized in terms of, really focusing on the experience of this retreat, the sense that Italians are, these kind of innocent victims. They're victims of not just the Red Army who's attacking them, but victims of the weather, right, of winter, victims of Mussolini and the fascist regime that sent them there, victims of Hitler and the Germans who they blame for, leaving them in the lurch, and victims of kind of incompetent generals. So there's a lot of myths that have developed that are part of this memory as well.
Yeah,
including what's known in Italian historiography as the myth of the Italiani Bravagente, which literally translates as Italians good people. It's this sense that it kind of, there's sort of two parts to this. It really becomes dominates the Italian narrative of the Second World War, and it's kind of, I think it kind of there's two parts to the Italiani Bravagente myth. One is that the Italians are seen as these kind of unwilling, poor fighters, poor combatants, and the other kind of goes hand in hand with it, that, well, they might have not done so well in combat, but they were kind of good-natured, kindly occupiers that were more likely to fraternize with the local populations than they didn't commit the same types of atrocities as their German allies did. What we've seen now from a not inconsiderable amount of scholarship that's come out in the past 20 years or so, is that neither parts of this myth bears scrutiny. I think much like, and I know you've talked about the clean Wehrmacht, the myth of the clean Wehrmacht on this program, right? Much like that, it's, in scholarly circles, it's been more or less thoroughly debunked, right? And I think the Italiani Bravagente myth is kind of moving in that direction as well. Lots of good historians have written, have examined Italian occupation practices in Libya, in Ethiopia, in Greece, Yugoslavia, and now as well on the Eastern Front, people like Thomas Schlemmer, Giorgio Scottoni, Maria Teresa Giusti, Matteo Sciana, and most recently Raffaello Panacci have all kind of worked to debunk, but also debate the validity of the Bravagente myth. And we're starting to see a more nuanced, complex picture that is emerging. And that's kind of where my chapter slots into that. I'm trying to kind of move beyond just, debunking the Bravagente myth and just like take a closer look at at what the Italians are actually doing and saying on the Eastern Front to to kind of explore the ways in which they are indeed entangled in Hitler's Vernichtungskrieg, this war of annihilation that is, aimed to eliminate Soviet communism as an ideology, but also to pave way for Lebensraum, for German living space, right, through the elimination of millions of Soviet Jews and Slavs, right? So it's how do the Italians slot into that is kind of my guiding question. And the picture that emerges is a complex one. It's there's a kernel of truth to the Bravagente myth, right? If you look at what's going on in the East in 1941-42, the Italians are not involved in the same sort of mass killing episodes that we see being conducted by the Germans, by the Romanians, by the Hungarians. They're not conducting the same types of mass violence that we see in other Italian occupied zones, especially what we'd previously seen in East Africa, but also what was like a developing, quite brutal counterinsurgency in Yugoslavia. So this is the other kind of question that I'm trying to answer here, is like, why do the Italians seem to be a little different on the Eastern Front, but ultimately, it's impossible to avoid this entanglement with Hitler's war, right? They're part of it.
Yeah.
So I'm looking to kind of, with my chapter here, I was trying to just explain the dynamics behind this behavior. And I do so in sort of a 4-part structure by looking at these kind of, what I see as these 4 major aspects of the Italian experience, of their participation on the Eastern Front, and I've got them listed here. I mean, the first 2 are sort of focusing on the context in which the Italians are operating, right? The political context, the ideological context. What are their aims? What is Mussolini hoping to get out of this campaign? Why are they there in the first place? And how are they trying to, what are they telling their soldiers? What are Italian soldiers being told that they are fighting for here?
Yeah, I mean, and that's what we want to, the viewers are already starting to talk about, those aspects of it. What's their ideology? Because they have their own aspirations. Italy has its own, that they were. Let's not forget, they lead the way in terms of fascist nations in Europe in terms of timing. So they have their own aspirations of what they want for the world, but they've also got to play in with Hitler's aspirations, which are in some ways in parallel, but also different.
Exactly, and that's where some of the complexity comes in, and I think it's a big part of explaining why the Italian behavior is a bit different on the Eastern Front than it is in places like Ethiopia and Yugoslavia, territories that they intend to include in an Italian empire. Well, they don't have those same imperial aspirations on the Eastern Front. So that's kind of a key part of the context. By legal framework structure, I'm talking about like, where do the Italians slot into the German command system in the East, and how do they relate to some of the directives and orders that the Germans are providing for their troops in the Eastern Front. The third and fourth aspects here are more situational, right? We're looking at, okay, what's the logistical situation? What's the military security situation that the Italians are facing? I think all these 4 components together help explain why the Italians behave the way they behave in the East. So we could talk a little bit more about, why the Italians are there in the first place and these war aims, because as we just said, right, this isn't, the fascist Italians, they have their own concept of living space. They refer to it as spazio vitale. Eastern Europe isn't it. It's not. Yeah. It's not where they're planning to create a to remake the Roman Empire. That's not where it's going to happen. They recognize Eastern Europe as falling kind of solely within Nazi Germany's orbit, within its sphere of interest. So there's not like a key political reason for Mussolini to get involved here. Strategically, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense either in terms of where like Italy's at in the war. They are fighting for their lives in the Mediterranean and North Africa. And so, you know, parceling off troops and probably more importantly, guns and trucks that they send to the Eastern Front, you know, it is a bit of a dispersal of what for Italy were scarce resources. Whereas for, you know, this expeditionary corps of 60,000 men is kind of a drop in the bucket in terms of the Eastern Front. So it doesn't make, you know, on the face of it, it doesn't make a lot of strategic sense for Mussolini. And yet, as soon as he gets news of the invasion of Barbarossa, he immediately offers Hitler this expeditionary corps. Hitler hasn't even asked for anything. Hitler has not planned on having the Italians join in the invasion of Barbarossa, so he hasn't consulted the Italians. But the Italian intelligence services know exactly what's going on. They are not surprised by the invasion, and they've prepared. They have contingency plans in place. And Mussolini's already decided he's going to send troops to the east. That is ultimately, it's a political choice. It's a political choice by Mussolini that is probably best explained as part of a broader shift in Italy's war effort. Italy had joined the war in, you know, had declared war against Britain and France in June 1940. With the stated aim of, you know, fighting its own war. It's fighting a parallel war alongside the Germans, but for distinctly Italian objectives. So the plan is in 1940 that Italy is going to fight its own war in the Mediterranean, North Africa, and they don't need German help. Okay, that does not end up going well, right? They end up being forced to accept German assistance in North Africa, right, with the Rommel's Africa Corps. And they end up requiring German assistance against Greece and Yugoslavia. With that, this parallel war is effectively over. And Mussolini shifts to what Italian historians have described as a subaltern war. They're now, Mussolini has recognized, okay, we are a subordinate partner within the Axis. And if we want to achieve our aims after this war, our best bet is to be on Hitler's good side. You know, we have to prove to Hitler that we are his top ally and his most effective ally. So when Mussolini gets word of the invasion of the Soviet Union, he recognizes, okay, this is going to be pretty important for Hitler, and Italy, you know, fascist Italy better have a presence there. So there's a number of other factors that are working their way into Mussolini's decision making here, but I think that's the biggest one. I think that's most important here to explain why the Italians have a presence, and it's going to have further ramifications, as we'll see later on.
And we've got lots of questions, Nick, coming in about, you know, what is their ideology? Can you put it as, we now know we can very simply lay out the Third Reich Nazi, you know, it's the killing of people who do not fit the Aryan bill, the expansion of the Third Reich to make more living space, and we can kind of sum it up like that. But can we make that easy sort of like Twitter length statement about the Italians, or is it a bit more complicated? You know, the examples of the questions we're getting are
Mussolini is never quite as clear about his war aims, and there are, you know, historians who debate exactly what Mussolini's end game really was. some don't take his bombastic statements as seriously as others. But at his, if you take kind of a maximalist interpretation of taking Mussolini's words seriously and at face value, then what in terms of foreign policy, what the fascist regime was about was recreating, not literally, but a semblance of a Roman Empire where Italy dominates the Mediterranean. So they're looking at expanding Italy's territorial possessions in North and East Africa. They're looking for some sort of imperial framework in the Balkans,
yeah,
where Italy may kind of lead a consortium of satellite states in the Balkans that all look to Rome for leadership. So this combination of direct and indirect empire seems to be what the fascists are envisioning, and a lot of these visions really become most concrete in 1941, 1942, when it looks like this might actually become a reality. That's when you start to see it's actually in some of the propaganda where we start to see these ideas really taking shape in a most concrete form. But that's precisely why the historians still kind of have debates about this.
I mean, and Trent Telenko said, Mussolini was very committed to anti-communism, and the Soviet Union was the founding head of it. I mean, if you're a fascist, then theoretically you have to be anti-communist, anti-Bolshevik by default, don't you? I mean, as
anti-communism,
democracy as well.
Anti-communism was probably the single most consistent theme in fascist propaganda going back to the founding of the fascist movement in 1919. So certainly this is something that Mussolini is saying. This is another reason that Mussolini is expressing for why the Italians need a presence in the East, is to help destroy communism. And it is the focus of, this is how he's selling the war in public, because you can't go around, right? The Italian newspapers can't go around and say, okay, we're now a subordinate partner in the Axis. So we need to send troops here because it will ingratiate us to Hitler. That's not how they're presenting this to the Italian public, and it's not how they're presenting it to Italian soldiers. So it's anti-communist themes that are kind of front and center in the Italian propaganda around the campaign. These are some headlines I've selected from Il Popolo d'Italia, which is was the newspaper that Mussolini himself had founded, kind of the semi-official organ of the fascist regime and party. So this is a home front newspaper, right, geared towards domestic audiences, ones that kind of inclined towards fascist ideological leanings, and so you can see here some of the themes that are being emphasized in the opening weeks of the campaign. They're describing the war as an anti-Bolshevik crusade that has the popular support worldwide, that Italy is fighting on the side of the good guys here to bring down the menace of communism. They're saying that the destruction of Bolshevism is the essential premise for victory, right? That victory in the wider war is going to require the destruction of Bolshevism, of Soviet communism. We also have what you'd expect, the kind of atrocity propaganda claiming that the Soviets were shooting prisoners of war. This is coming out really early before you could even actually have any evidence to demonstrate of this. You've got racialized elements to this propaganda, referring to the Soviet Union as the empire of Tamerlane, right? So depicting the Soviets as a non-European, kind of Asiatic other, This one in the top right is talking about the Romanian pogrom against the Jewish population of Iași in rather sympathetic terms, saying that this was a necessary response against the Judeo-Bolshevik bloc. So, I mean, we're seeing a lot of the same themes that we see in Nazi propaganda and justifications for the war. So this is publicly how the war is being presented to populations in Italy.
Richard Hargreaves, his esteemed historian, made a good point about religion, where the Nazis sort of keep religion very much. They don't completely remove it, but they kind of push it into a cupboard in the dark corner of the room. You're not going to get religion out of Italy, are you? So, you know, the anti-Bolshevism's I'll start that sentence again. Bolshevism's obvious anti-religious stance makes them it's a perfect response to say we are going about this because they're trying to take away our faith in a sense and our established religions, and you know, so that's a key aspect of the Italian that's different to the Germans.
Anti-communism was a major point of consensus between the fascist regime and more conservative institutions like the Royal Italian Army, but also the Italian Catholic Church.
Yeah,
and certainly the fascist propaganda ministry, they think that this propaganda is being effective, and they think that they're reporting that it's particularly popular with Catholic populations, and that they have parish priests who are spontaneously spouting off these messages as well. So this idea of being part of a pan-European crusade or holy war of sorts to end once and for all this communist menace, arguably has a fair amount of popular backing.
And as people are saying in the sidebar, that kind of moves across into Romania and Hungary as well. You know, Grant's fantastic book, The Holy War, about Romania, is that religion and the various different visions of religion, you can't take it out of the story. Whereas with the Third Reich or the Nazis, to some extent, you can take religion out and everything remains the same. The ideology is not as religiously based as it is with other nations.
That's right, and the Italians, I mean, fascist Italy had signed a concordat with the Vatican back in 1929 that had really allowed, this was a deal with the Italian Catholic Church and the Vatican that kind of spelled out the church-state relations in Italy, sort of stabilized that relationship, which previously had not been too good, going back to the pre-fascist liberal era. It was a very anti-clerical liberal government there that did not get along well with the popes, especially because Italian unification has stripped the papacy of much of its territory. So that is dealt with in these 1929 accords, and after that we start to see Italian fascism sort of drawing from the language of Italian Catholicism more readily. This is something I've actually explored elsewhere in my scholarship, is the way that the Italian army, which it traditionally is actually kind of this anti-clerical institution itself, but the way that the Italian army ends up reverting to themes of kind of Catholic piety in its propaganda during the Second World War. And I'm glad you mentioned Grant Harwood's work on Romania, because that factors in here too, right? In terms of how do these themes then transmit themselves to the soldiers on the front, right?
Yeah.
They're not, they're receiving a smattering of these reports from, of these daily newspapers from Italy, but it's not a reliable supply. And often soldiers on the front did not find domestic newspapers to be all that convincing, right? It didn't speak to their reality in the field. So for the Italian military authorities, they actually thought it was really important to provide, to create publications in the field, right? So there's these Italian service newspapers that are printed and distributed in the field. One of the first of which I have here, which is actually, it's an Italian version of a Romanian field newspaper. And so as this Italian Expeditionary Corps is making its way east, they go through Romania and Romanian occupied territory. And so they collaborate with Romanian authorities to publish a few editions of this Romanian newspaper, Soldatul, that in Italian they call Il Soldato. And certainly this was an area of, where we see similarity between Italian and Romanian representations of the war, is around this theme of the holy war and religious crusade. So yeah, Grant's work is really excellent on that. And we presented together at, on the same panel at a conference on this stuff a couple of years ago.
Brilliant stuff. I just want to say how much I'm thoroughly enjoying this, and loads of questions coming in for later on, but in the meantime, back to you.
Okay. Yeah, I've got some other examples of the printed propaganda that the Italians distribute in the East. As they keep advancing into the Donbass, they capture a Soviet printing press, and they experiment with manipulating the Cyrillic type to produce a leaflet that you can actually read in Italian. So I mean, it's just kind of interesting. There's not a heck of a lot here other than a quote from Mussolini in the top right corner there that's saying how the fight against Bolshevism is the battle of all Italians, right? That all Italians are behind this fight to bring down Bolshevism, just like they have been ever since the March on Rome and when the fascists seized power in 1922. It's not really until things settled down after those Christmas battles in the Donetsk Basin that the Italian Expeditionary Corps can kind of establish its own regularly occurring periodical, a weekly newspaper called Dovunque, which basically translates as anywhere. And it was based on the submissions and submissions received from officers and soldiers. So they actually called upon, personnel of the Expeditionary Corps to submit drawings, poems, short stories to be published in the newspaper. The themes of Dovunque generally I've found to be rather quite consistent with what we saw coming out of the domestic newspapers. A particular emphasis on those anti-communist themes, a lot of atrocity propaganda, but also this other interesting theme that we see is probably equally as prevalent, this sense that Italians are also there to liberate the Ukrainian and Russian people from the yoke of communism and Stalinism. So we see an example of this kind of propaganda here around this sense of a liberating, civilizing mission. That's what this soldier who's writing means by this crusade, right? This great crusade is not just to annihilate Soviet communism, but in the process, they're going to free innocent Russians and Ukrainians. And much like the Germans, the Italians, they refer kind of generically to the populations of the Soviet Union as Russians. But so that's why this propaganda is saying our great crusade will finally liberate the Russian people that our great leaders, Mussolini and Hitler, will situate within the new world order with a vision and mission of civilization, not of destruction. So this is propaganda that is not entirely consistent with Hitler's envisioned new order, right? But it doesn't pose as many problems for Italian fascism, right? Since Italian fascism really had no imperial vision for Eastern Europe, they may have found this less of a contradiction. At any rate, it's not, even this liberating message is not entirely unique to Italian propaganda. We have another contribution in the German-Soviet War volume by David Harrisville, who actually shows something very similar going on within the Wehrmacht, especially in Ukraine, and especially in 1941-42, is that the Wehrmacht itself in this area at the same time was quite willing to allow its propagandists to kind of spout off similar messages about liberating the Ukrainian people, even though it went totally against their policies and much of their actual behavior. So I found that yeah, my chapter and Harrisville's chapter really spoke to each other quite well here. We were looking at kind of similar things in the front of propaganda. Mm. Those themes, as we've already discussed, were popular, especially amongst Italian Catholics. I think this idea of being there as part of this kind of crusade to defend Christian Europe against godless atheist communism, and that this was not just about destroying the Soviets, but about actually saving people who were living under the yoke of Stalinism. This was something that Italian Catholics could more easily get behind, and that we see actually coming out in other forms of propaganda on the Eastern Front, like the messages that chaplains, army chaplains, are delivering in the East. We have a photograph here from the Italian archives of one of these chaplains conducting mass for a Bersaglieri regiment in the spring of 1942. On the Eastern Front, in every theater, army chaplains functioned, they got involved in propaganda work. And it's clear that in this sense, they are, contributing to the message that the military wants to send out. But it's kind of especially around this theme of liberation, that this is a liberating crusade. The army kind of complained that the chaplains didn't do enough kind of promoting hatred of the enemy, but but they're still using this language of anti-communist crusading.
But it's an important distinction, Nick, that there's this overriding sense of liberating and conversion rather than just conquering and murdering that you get elsewhere in the Eastern Front. When Ed Westerman was on a couple of weeks ago, they've barely taken one of the cities, and within hours they're already rounding up Jews and killing them and hanging people in the town squares, whereas the Italians are at face value, from what you're saying, going for a slightly less obvious, no, we're going to speak to you first, speak to you about God, the Italian way. It is interesting, but at the same time, the overall message is one of dominance and control.
Yeah, so you have these kind of seemingly contradictory, conflicting messages in Italian propaganda, and sometimes in the same source. So I mean, here's another example from Dovunque, that is highlighting more so the element of hatred, yeah. Right? And we see how, we're looking now towards the end of that first year, June 1942. They've been occupying the Donbass for several months now, and they found that actually, this population hasn't responded entirely enthusiastically to being liberated. And we can start to see that playing coming out in some of this propaganda as well. So now we see very dismissive, contemptuous views of Russians, linking them to the Jewish Bolshevik enemy. So you get both of these at the same time, right? Of both this sense of a liberating crusade, but also this annihilation of the opponent. And when the people that you're trying to liberate don't really seem to want to be liberated, well, it's easy for them to kind of then slide into that group that needs to be annihilated, right? So the propaganda it's kind of open to several interpretations, and I think it could have gone in different directions depending on the circumstances and situations that the Italians found themselves in.
Yeah. Just
to complete this discussion of propaganda, I'll end with this. This is another example, not from the newspaper, but from a speech, an order of the day that's issued by in this case, the commander of a Bersaglieri regiment. And I just, this example really highlights how both of these, this liberating and annihilating themes could be presented at the same time, right? You've got the sense that, yeah, the Italians are crusading against godless Soviet communism for the triumph of Roman civilization, describing also the lands and people as increasingly hostile, right? And quite contemptuous, describing the Soviet populations now as barbaric and as passive, right? He's kind of critical of the supine passivity of these populations. So it shows just how challenging it would have been to maintain this distinction between people to be liberated and the regime to be annihilated.
We had a comment from Sean Brennan about you're giving these fantastic Italian sources and Italian newspapers and what have you. This seems to be propaganda aimed at Italian soldiers. Was there Italian propaganda that was for occupied Soviet civilians? Which again, when we compare to the Nazis themselves, perhaps further north, if their only intention is to go in and murder, there's no need to produce documentation if all you go do is kill them anyway. But do the Italians have any sense of spreading their message in language the locals will understand, both in literal terms, in terms of written language, but also by the ideals they were? Because as we always talk about in this channel, there are elements of the Soviet Union that are more willingly part of the Union than there are others, so to speak. So are they doing anything themselves about having any kind of what we would call today a hearts and minds program to convert people?
I would say, so that's an excellent question. And indeed, the propaganda I presented so far is entirely geared towards Italian soldiers. Those same propaganda officers are in charge of propaganda for local populations. However, the Italian command doesn't really want to get involved in that. So in terms of like preparing Italian propaganda to deliver to occupied Ukrainians, they don't seem to do a lot of that, mainly because the Germans have told them, no, that's our responsibility. You leave that to us. And I found an example where actually the Italian propaganda, the fascist propaganda ministry back in Rome, the Ministry of Popular Culture, produced this like colorful pamphlet and a whole bunch of, they printed off like, I don't know, 50,000 of these pamphlets and then sent them to the Eastern Front to be distributed to the Ukrainian populations. This is coming from the fascist leadership in Rome, and there it is kind of presenting this hearts and minds, look, we are bringing civilization to you, you should welcome us with open arms. This is the message they're trying to send. The commanding officer sends it back. The Italian commander sends it back and says, look, I can't distribute this because that's a German responsibility. Now, I'm sure at the local level, in terms of when Italian troops entered a village or town for the first time, just like German troops in Ukraine in 1941, many of them, they may well have helped, reopen the local church or things like that. The Germans were doing this too, especially in Ukraine, because the German Army Group South Rear Area Command had a more kind of pragmatic mindset or attitude towards Ukrainians. So the Italians kind of benefit from being part of that as well. But in terms of actual written propaganda created by Italians for Ukrainian populations, I didn't come across a whole lot of that. And it seems to have been because of this, because it wasn't seen as part of an Italian responsibility.
Okay,
And I know we need to keep moving along here, but that does kind of segue into this other piece of the context here, which is the legal framework that the Italians are operating in, right? So General Messe, who we see here, he's the commander of the corps, and he's telling Rome, no, I can't accept this propaganda. I can't distribute it because the Germans are saying that they want to have full control over that. And that reveals that, the Italians are operating within a somewhat restricted legal framework here. So it's important to understand how the Expeditionary Corps slots into the Axis command structure. And again, this is Mussolini's political choice plays a role here. Why are they there? They're to enhance Italian prestige, right? And make Italy seem a more important ally to Hitler. So Mussolini has some caveats when he offers these troops. He says, I don't want them doing rear area security duty. I want them fighting on the front and making the headlines. And that's what they end up doing. They serve, they put together what's actually a fairly potent force by Italian standards. And they serve as part of General Kleist's Panzer Army in 1941. So they're operating as part of a German mechanized formation. The Expeditionary Corps includes 3 divisions. You've got the Pasubio Division, Torino Division. These two are they're called Divisioni Autotrasportabili, which means they were motor transportable divisions. So they're basically standard Italian infantry divisions, but they had a few more trucks, and they were trained for motor transport. They had a few more trucks, a few more anti-tank guns, but not enough trucks to make them fully motorized. And then they have this Celere division, which is another kind of peculiar Italian formation that's a mix of horse-mounted cavalry, truck-mounted bersaglieri, light infantry, and light tanks. And they're backed by this large logistical service called the Intendenza. So it's like a reasonably well-equipped force in terms of that it would have more trucks, more anti-tank guns than a typical Italian infantry corps would have. They were intended to engage in a war movement on the Eastern Front. So they are attached to Kleist's group there. They're constantly on the move through 1941, basically just trying to keep up with this Panzer Army because they don't actually have enough trucks to do so. And then they finally take those positions in the Donbass in 1942. What this means is that the Italians, because of this frontline deployment, I argue that this kind of makes the Italians less directly involved in some of the nastiest aspects of the Vernichtungskrieg,
right,
which tended to happen the further back you go from the front lines. Right? Especially in the civilian administered areas like Reichskommissariat, Ukraine, things like that. This does not absolve the Italians of responsibility. Messe, the commanding general, later is going to claim that as a result, he had nothing to do with the Holocaust, nothing to do with prisoner of war policy. But we know that the Italians witnessed these things. We know that 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 large logistical corps, the Intendenza, was operating out of Donetsk, out of Stalino, which was under German administration for a couple months during the occupation, had a ghetto. That there's linkages with German police. German historian Thomas Schlemmer has found at least one example, one case where it seems the Italians did hand over 100 Jews, as many as 100 Jews, to the Einsatzgruppen. But that seems to be this one. He's found this in German archives. That's like the lone piece of evidence we have for involvement in the Holocaust.
But does that just mean there weren't those atrocities going on, or they were taking place outside of, if you like, the Italians' areas of where they have the control and influence? I mean,
they were taking place outside of the Italian controlled areas,
right?
And it's more so because the Italians aren't being asked to do it, and they don't see it as their responsibility, as opposed to the Italians actively going out of their way to develop like a unique hearts and minds approach, if that makes sense.
Okay. There's a question about the area they fought in. It came in much earlier on, but I'm asking it now. Preston was asking, why were all of the Germany allies sent to the south? It makes sense for Romania since they're right there, but was there a specific reason everyone else was there as well? I mean, is it a question of just sort of, random how they assign north, central, south, or is there some sort of logic behind the Italians taking the sector they did?
That's a good question. I don't really know the answer. I think that would require, looking at the German sources. That would ultimately be where the Germans decided to deploy them, and it probably just makes the most sense with the train, like with the train schedules and the railroad lines, right? To bring supplies from Italy and transport troops from Italy to the east, took them on itineraries that kind of ran through Hungary and Romania, right? So and the Hungarians and Romanians are using those same supply lines as well. So as a result, they kind of all end up in the same area. That would be my guess. Later on in 1942, after they leave the Donbass and advance to the Don, the Italians end up being situated right between a Romanian army and a Hungarian army. And there's some, I found some reports suggesting that was done to keep the Romanians and Hungarians from shooting at each other, but I'm not, I wouldn't totally ascribe to that.
I mean, another question about, you said that they don't want to get caught up in the occupation aspect of it, but Bruce is asking, well, you've kind of hinted, you've partially explained this, that they want to control their own logistics to some extent. And I guess that's also born out of experience. As you say, they're already fighting in North Africa, they're fighting in Yugoslavia, and it makes sense for them to as best they can be masters of their own destiny. So if there aren't bullets and bandages and beans getting to the front, at least it's their own army's fault, not someone else's army. Is that sort of the Italian way? They want to be to control what they can?
The Italian logistical personnel have a presence at these various waypoints along the way to the Eastern Front, and then in Donetsk they have the larger the larger force of trucks to actually get everything to the, trucks and wagons to get everything to the frontline positions. So they are helping move these supplies along, but they're reliant on German rail capacity, right? And the agreements in place are that it's really the Germans who are supplying the Italians, right? The Italians are sending their own rations, right, and their own equipment and ammunition, but it's on German. It seems to be on German railway lines. They're using German railway capacity to do it. So basically, it's Italian supply is dependent on the Germans as a result.
And Richard is confirming that he's agreeing with you. The Eighth Army was there to provide the buffer between the Romanians and the Hungarians. So another historian's in agreement with you there. So
well,
this is really fascinating, and it is potentially opening up lots of rabbit holes that we can't go down them all in the sidebar. But it proves people are really interested. So back to you, Nick. It's really good.
Okay. We do have a picture here of Soviet prisoners of war being marched through what I think is Donetsk. It's labeled February 1942, showing that, you know, the Italians were witnessing this, right, back in this administered hub, jointly administered hub of Donetsk. I think it's worth dwelling on the prisoner of war issue for a bit, because as you've heard from some of our other contributors, right, this was the area where the Wehrmacht as an institution was probably most culpable for war crimes, right? Yep. Soviet POWs were, I think, Nazi Germany's single largest victim group by February 1942, right? By that time, 2 million had died already. So, you know, how did the Italians slot into that? There's no evidence that the Italians are involved in executing the Commissar order, which is this infamous order to shoot on the spot or well, after interrogation to shoot political officers of the Red Army, right? Despite the fact that they are uniformed officers. So a blatant breach of international law. Not too many people are actually killed in this way, just because there's not that many commissars, but it's just a blatant breach of international law. We don't see the Italians participating in that. Of course, by the time that the Italians arrive on the Eastern Front at the end of August 1941, most commissars weren't surrendering anyway, right? They kind of knew that was suicidal, or they tried to hide amongst the regular troops, and then they'd be discovered further back, which would have been long after the Italians had passed them down. So there's no evidence that the Italians are involved in that. I did find agreement suggesting that prisoners of war were supposed to be an Italian responsibility. Like initially, when the campaign began, they had envisioned sending Soviet, you know, Red Army soldiers captured by the Italians should go back to Italian POW camps in Italy. That never happens. They decide it's not feasible with those kind of rail transport schedules we were talking about. They decide it's not feasible, and so they just turn over responsibility to the Germans because they can, and that's the easiest thing to do. There are a few, like a handful of Italian-run transit camps. We have very little information on these, but the reports that I did find suggest the same conditions that we see in, Dallas Michelbacher was talking about Romanian transit camps, actually very similar conditions in the Italian-run camps in terms of poor hygiene, overcrowding, problems with dysentery and typhus epidemics. When things go south, when things don't go well in these transit camps, and the Italians get overwhelmed, they simply turn them over to the Germans, right? Because they can, because they're operating, right, as this little expeditionary corps, this frontline force, that their priority is fighting on the front lines. And they decide, well, okay, taking care of the POWs is too hard. We'll just turn that over to the Germans. So they're content to just kind of offload that responsibility to the Germans. And as I said before, they seem actually rather reluctant to establish kind of a distinct autonomous policy in the East. And I think part of that too is that the Italians are very cautious. They don't want to be seen as stepping on German toes when it comes to major policy decisions, because they're concerned about reciprocity. They're concerned that the Germans are then going to go to Italian commands in North Africa and the Balkans and kind of start stepping on Italian toes. So I find that, yeah, my sense is that the Italian command authorities in the East are very cautious about, you know, how much they want to establish a uniquely Italian approach and policy to occupation, because they recognize the Eastern Front as falling solely within the German sphere of interest. And they want the Germans likewise to respect the Italian sphere of interest in the Mediterranean.
That's a very good point. I'm kind of going to expand on it. And the Italians are very much seeing this running in conjunction with North Africa, the Mediterranean, and Yugoslavia. They're looking at, spinning all these plates in terms of their logistics, their attitude, their place within the axis as well. Whereas the Germans maybe have separated those campaigns slightly more in the way they address them. There's the Eastern Front, there's Mediterranean, whereas the Italians, it is all really the same war in different places.
And it would make sense.
Just want to add, your fellow Canadians, General Partisan there made a great comment about logistics. I just have to put it up there because it made me laugh. The Italian logistics system is like Deliveroo without their own bikes, which I just think is a nice little summary there. Thank you very much, General. Wonderful comment. But yeah, sorry to interrupt you.
No, why don't we talk a bit more about logistics?
Yeah.
This is probably the area of the Vernichtungskrieg, of the War of Annihilation, where the Italians are most directly involved in a way, is the deliberate starvation of the Soviet populations, right? So the Nazi vision for the East, right, is that, thanks to the within Nazi Lebensraum ideology, is that it renders millions of Slavs that are living in these territories redundant, right? Especially in urban places like Donetsk, right? There's not a whole lot of room for urban populations in this territory that the Germans plan to turn into an agricultural settler colony. So, and the German scholarship on Germany's war has shown how this Nazi thinking and acceptance of starvation as policy sort of converged with the Wehrmacht's concept, a kind of radical, ruthless concept of military necessity, right? That the Wehrmacht at the same time, they're under pressure to live off the land, and they're prioritizing which food supply is going to the German occupation army, some's going back to Germany, and then only what's left is going to feed the local population, right? So you have this convergence of ideological and economic kind of and military imperatives there. And I think we see the same logic, the same dynamic at play with the Italians. Not so much that we don't really necessarily see them buying into the ideological side of things, although you can see how their propaganda could be used to support that. But rather, because the Italian army is operating as a frontline army corps on the Eastern Front, right? They are under those same pressures. And I've just described how they are reliant on basically the goodwill of the Germans to keep them supplied. Well, the Germans aren't going to prioritize this Italian Expeditionary Corps with supply. So as a result, from the fall of 1941 on, the Italians are facing acute supply shortages of their own. And they're facing, you see the muddy conditions that they encounter near their frontline positions. They face the same problems with the muddy season, the Rasputitsia, as the Germans are. And as a result, you have a lot of pressure on the Italians to reduce their burden on the supply system. And so they turn to the local resources that are available. This photograph on the right comes from an Italian memoir. The author kind of talks playfully about how he and his comrades grouped together to scour the area for what they euphemistically called local resources, but it was like chickens and things like that. Not really recognizing that this is amounted to looting, right? To individual looting. So we know that that's going on, and increasingly it becomes institutionalized, where the head of the Intendenza of the Italian Logistical Corps, Carlo Bellino, is authorizing quite ruthless requisitioning. In the previous quotations I've shown you, I'd highlighted some of the words in red just to make them stand out. That was my doing. In this case, the underlining was in the original document. This is to give you a sense of how radical wanted the Italians to be with this requisitioning. This memorandum came out towards the end of the occupation in Donbass, actually preparing them for how they should behave as they continue to advance forward. But it shows this is the end of kind of a radicalizing trend that had carried through the occupation of the Donbass. So we see here is, where the Italians see themselves as having no alternative but to engage in this process, despite the obvious cost that the obvious toll that it's taking on the local populations. I mean, already in autumn of 1941, the Italian commands are reporting there are no local resources, and yet they continue to call for the ruthless exploitation of said resources. Mm. So that example there kind of shows how environmental conditions and situational factors could contribute to radicalizing policy, right? It was a genuine a genuine logistical crisis that propelled the Italian Expeditionary Corps to participate in the Nazi starvation policy. So just to conclude my talk here, I'll discuss kind of what's the last section of the chapter, which is kind of continues to explore the situational element here, right? Of what is the actual combat and environmental and security situation that the Italians face on the east. Because it's these ground level experiences that affect how Italian personnel actually view their mission in the East, how they view their Soviet enemies, how they view the occupied populations, right? This is interacting or kind of engaging those different contradictory themes in the propaganda, potentially. And here we see, in terms of environmental factors, as we said, the Italians are experiencing the same things that their neighboring German units would have. They're dealing with vast spaces, overstretched supply lines. They're complaining about the dusty roads in the summer, choking on this dust, and then in the spring and fall being in a muddy quagmire. Of course, the snow and the extreme cold in the winter. This really is front and center in any Italian memoirs that are written about the war, but it's also in the war diaries from the time, like the unit war diaries that are in the archives. They are constantly commenting on the landscape and the environmental conditions that they are encountering. They really find it unique and uniquely challenging. The photographs here came from the war diary of the 6th Bersaglieri Regiment, where they were kind of tracing their route out to the Donbass. They were reinforcing the Celeri division in early 1942, and the photos show them going through snowy, windswept landscapes, and then there's this major thaw that is causing problems. So I mean, the environmental conditions are challenging and just as brutalizing for Italians as they would be for Germans, Hungarians, and Romanians.
Yeah.
Combat, perhaps a little less so in a way. We read about, in the summer of 1941, it's a lot of exhausting marches. The Italians are involved on these kind of flanking maneuvers as part of Panzer Army Kleist. They lack heavy tanks or heavy anti-tank guns of their own, but they're fortunate that they don't face a lot of the heavy Soviet tanks in 1941. In December, with the Battle of Christmas that I mentioned, this is when the Italians come into a spot of trouble. They, as part of these many Soviet counteroffensives that are being launched in the winter of 1941-42, the Italians are hit. They're hit by waves of Soviet infantry and cavalry. There's some pretty desperate fighting. Some Italian units are briefly overrun, and they managed to make successful counterattacks and regain the lost territory with the help of German tanks. The Expeditionary Corps' losses in 1941 are, I'd say, significant, but typical of the Eastern Front. I mean, that Expeditionary Corps of 60,000 men, only what, like half of that would be combat troops, though. But their losses, they recorded 633 killed, 2,500 wounded, 265 missing. So it's not, it's not nothing, but this is also not, this is a lot less than what German units were suffering in the Demant's pocket or something like that, right? And there's no sense that, as tough as things got during the Christmas battles, I don't think there's a sense that the Italian army is facing an existential crisis militarily at any point in the occupation, right? So they don't necessarily have those same kind of brutalizing imperatives, militarily speaking. After that, the front line gets pretty quiet, right? And we have this equally fairly quiet period of occupation. The rear area is also reasonably quiet, and I think that's quite important too in explaining why we don't see some of the more violent potential that we saw in some of those propagandistic statements coming to the fore and actually transferring into actual behavior. The fact is that the Italians don't face very much partisan resistance in the Donbass in the winter of 1941-42. Here we see some Italian military police, carabinieri, doing simple document checks. That's a lot of what they were doing in the Donbass, and they reported very few episodes of partisan activity. And importantly as well, these Italian units were never pulled out of the line to participate in major anti-partisan operations. And I don't have, because they were never asked to do it, I don't necessarily have a rationale for that. That could have had something to do with Mussolini's insistence that they operate as a frontline force. But at any rate, these three divisions were needed to hold that frontline position. So they're not used in that way, in the way that some German infantry divisions are already in 41-42. And it was these kind of large-scale anti-partisan operations that often became the most bloody and that often overlapped with aspects of the Holocaust, right? So I think that's situationally significant that the Italians aren't involved in that. Why is this? Is this a response to their jolly occupation policy? I think it's more so due to the conditions and circumstances that basically limited the growth of the Soviet partisan movement across southern Ukraine in 1941 in general. And a lot of this has to do with historical context. So the way that the operations are conducted in Ukraine in 1941, we don't see the same, certainly in the Donbass, we don't see the same like large numbers of Red Army troops being surrounded and then kind of dispersing and becoming partisans as a result out of survival. So there's not, that's kind of your main Soviet partisan movement in 1941 are those guys, right? Or Red Army soldiers who have been cut off, realize that surrendering is suicidal, and they make for the woods or swamps and try to survive, but they got their guns with them. We don't really see that happening in the Italian sector. So you don't have that base of recruits for the partisan movement. You also don't really have a lot of good places for partisans to go and hide.
Yeah.
Right? It's a major industrial urban zone. Those are not good sites for guerrilla activity in the Second World War. you're too, especially in this case, you're too close to the front line. You got all these combat units right there, and all the communication lines head into the cities. So it's pretty easy, you know, if you were trying to launch a partisan uprising in Donetsk, it would be pretty easy for the Axis forces to converge and crush it. Nor are there any extensive swamps or forests in the Donbass for them to take refuge in. We see it. Again, I told you the Italians are really fascinated by the landscape they encountered. So another, you know, photograph of what they were dealing with there. So I think, you know, I think that has more to do with the lack of partisan activity than anything else. And the Italians are kind of fortunate to be operating in this space. It doesn't mean that you don't have some concerns or a fear of the partisan that roots itself there. The pages of Dovunque include this poem that I was quite proud of. I managed to get it to rhyme in English, but it's but this poem that is, you know, expressing fear of and loathing of the Soviet partisan. So it's showing that the Italians certainly had heard of the partisan menace. They're hearing this from their intelligence reports, right? And the Germans are sending them intelligence reports from other fronts saying, here's how the partisan movement is developing and what they're doing and how we need to fight them. And we see here again the potential that you know, if the Italians had faced a major partisan movement in the Donbass, they might have behaved differently. How would this poet, you know, this poet is dreaming of capturing and shooting the partisan, right? The Italian army does not have a softer view towards irregular fighters than the Germans do, really. And we've seen.
I think, just to interrupt, that's my takeaway from what you just said, is that the Germans were going to force their way of doing things, regardless of the terrain, whether it's the north, central, south. That was always, we discussed that in the previous shows, very much part of the whole Operation Barbarossa plan. But the Italians, in the end, maybe benefited isn't quite the right word, but the terrain of where they ended up influenced their attitudes to it, because of it, as you say, being less conducive to partisan activity. It wasn't perhaps the intense armored warfare. But that quote there about wanting to kill partisan, the undercurrent, the capability to go to another level of viciousness was clearly there below the surface. It's not like they didn't do it because it was absolutely against their nature. It's always there. It never quite got to the stage where that level kicked in. Is that fair?
Precisely. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. And because in Yugoslavia, in Ethiopia, where they do face serious guerrilla insurgencies, they behave differently.
Yeah.
Right. And so we see that potential here in the propaganda. We see that potential in the way that the Italians do treat the so-called partisans that they come across in the East, which is by shooting them. And there are a few cases. I don't think they're really partisans that they're shooting. It seems to happen mostly during frontline combat. And my best guess is that the Italians have captured like either fugitive Soviet officials or members of the NKVD destruction battalions who were tasked with carrying out Stalin's scorched earth policy, and that they're shooting them as partisans.
Or, as happened elsewhere, anybody that they just wanted to get rid of, because partisans becomes that kind of all-encompassing term that they were just anti-establishment type. You know, we see that more in the German side, but it's that the Axis has that ability to just use language to cover. Just a partisan. It was a partisan. You know, it's an all-encompassing term.
Yes, and what we see with the Italians is that they don't encounter conditions on the Eastern Front that lead to the radicalization of that use of language, right? To cover up other forms of violence that they want to conduct. They don't see a need to conduct mass reprisals in the Ukraine. in the Donbass, because there's like, they face like 3 episodes of partisan activity, and they're capturing people. Like when they do, this is the biggest this is the biggest group of partisans that they capture, so-called partisans. Like this is the big event for the Italian military police in the spring of 1942, is uncovering this nascent underground network as it's forming. And they arrest 25 people. They decide that 16 of them are legitimate partisans and spies. And but it's also interesting how they handle them, right? The Italian police, they identify the ringleader and they shoot him. The others, they turn over to the Germans. They say they turn over 9 to the German field police, the Wehrmacht police. Those ones likely were executed. And 6 they turn over to the SD that were likely sent to labor camps. So what we see here again is, you know, the Italian, kind of like how they dealt with the prisoners of war, the Italians sort of taking advantage of what other historians have referred to as kind of this work sharing modus at play on the Eastern Front, right? Is that they were able to kind of shed responsibility by, you know, passing the dirty work of the actual killing down the line, in this case to the Germans, right? To German police who are able to do that, which again shows the importance of just kind of where the Italians slotted in to the German command command structure, that they had this opportunity, like they didn't have to do this dirty work, so they didn't. They passed it off to the Germans.
Very good point.
So that's, I mean, I guess, like, to conclude, my findings are, you know, that the Italian occupation in the Donbass here is not particularly bloody, right? Especially if you compare it to the Germans and other sectors of the Eastern Front, the Romanians and their behavior in Transnistria, say, or the Hungarians who, unlike the Italians, right, the Hungarian corps is sent for rear area security duty in a swampy area of central Ukraine, and they are much more ruthless, right? So I think that I don't think that these differences are necessarily because of these innate qualities of Italians, or even because of a unique policy or that Italian commands develop for themselves, but it's these more tangible kind of situational factors, the context of Mussolini's political decision making, why the Italians are there in the first place, the context of where they fit into the German command, the fact that they are sent to southeastern Ukraine in 1941-42. This all has the effect of sort of moderating Italian behavior on the Eastern Front.
I think the word you use there, moderating, sums it up very well. It's like, I'm going to use a crass analogy, but it's like if there was a serial killer operating in the same town as Jeffrey Dahmer back in the day and he killed 3 people, he would seem much less awful than Jeffrey Dahmer because it was only 3, whereas Jeffrey Dahmer did whatever he did there. But then take away the Jeffrey Dahmer element, and in his own right, it seems pretty horrific. And I think the mistake, not the mistake, but the reality is we're always comparing what the Italians did to the very worst of what the Germans did themselves elsewhere in the front. So therefore, naturally, it doesn't look quite as shit, but only on a scale of shitness. That's the kind of point I'm making. It's still shit. It's just not as shit. And with that, there's a great question. Another one came in from Sean Brennan. The German army effectively told their troops they would be exempt from discipline on how badly they treated civilians. Was there anything similar for Italians? So the idea of the Geneva Convention came up in the various POW shows. Did the Italians have some sort of overriding policy that they would be aware of what they are allowed and not allowed to do as an invading force.
Yeah, so you're referring to the, to the infamous kind of Barbarossa decree, it's often called, that that the German high command issues on the eve of the invasion, that that basically tells German soldiers, okay, if you commit breaches of international law, we're not actually going to punish you for them.
Yeah.
I haven't found anything similar for the Italians. They in terms of actual discipline of their soldiers, and I haven't looked extensively at court-martial records, but my sense is, they seem far more concerned about the same things that the Germans are concerned about, which is disobedience of commanders' authority and theft from the military institution. They're more concerned about going after those cases than they are protecting civilians. But it's not. Yeah, I haven't found evidence of kind of a systematic conspiracy in the way that we see with the Barbarossa decree.
Okay, thank you. And Richard Hargreaves again is confirming how much he enjoyed it. Now it underscores a lot of the work he's done on that era, which is very nice. Thanks for saying that, Sean. And Sir Capo is kind of sort of summing up in some ways what you say. No, sorry, that wasn't what I wanted to say. It is. Would they have been involved in war crimes regardless of the living on the land policy? I mean, the hunger policy, the whole, it is a wider thing that as we said, covers the Hungarians, Romanians, Italians as well. But it's all to do with the circumstances and the location is kind of what you're saying. Is that whereas the Third Reich, the ideology is first on the list, and then the terrain is having a secondary effect. With the Italians, it's the other way around. Is that sort of how we're saying it?
Well, I think that even in the Third Reich, it kind of depends on who you are, right? For some actors, some people that are involved in this process, ideology is playing a bigger role for them. For others, it's pragmatism and military necessity. This is something that our editor Jeff Rutherford has written a bit about, right? And so I think that the Italians slot in there more as on the military necessity side of things, and I think that's one of the takeaways here too, is that we need to be careful. Like, what are we comparing the Italians to? Because if we're comparing Italians to Germans, right, as these general broad categories, that doesn't work very well, right? We should be comparing the Italians as this frontline expeditionary corps in the Donbass to German frontline units in similar areas, right? Or Hungarian or Romanian units. And there I suspect we would see that the differences are not so stark.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, and again, even just at the beginning, the difference with the term fascist and Nazi, because they're different, but there's an overlap, as we're finding out in the way those words get thrown around in 2025. That has a bearing on how we analyze the ideological aspects, and again, classifications of the Italians come with the religious aspect that perhaps the Nazis don't. We talked about that. The terrain makes influence. I mean, there's as with all good shows on World War II TV, it gives us lots to think about, as well as answering questions. It also poses more, which is the best thing there. So we'll bring things to an end. But what was your hope when people read your chapter as part of this book? Was it to broadly reconsider what they perceived of the Italians on the Eastern Front, or was that really the aim?
Yeah, like I said, I was aiming to provide here's a broad survey that gives you a sense of what the Italians were doing on the Eastern Front. So I did try to take a broad swath. You've got a little bit of, a sense of the type of conditions they were facing in terms of combat, in terms of the environment, with definitely an emphasis on occupation practices, and and propaganda, which is an area of particular interest for me. It's an area that I think, is often poorly integrated, or not thoroughly integrated into these studies. Certainly one of the works that kind of initially inspired me to get interested in this topic was like Omer Bartov's work on barbarization of the Eastern Front. And, historians have pushed back on Bartov in some respects, but I still think the way that he integrates the propagandistic messaging and ideological indoctrination into, with these situational factors is a helpful and viable approach. So I'm hoping that readers of my chapter in particular will get just kind of a broad sense of what the Italians were actually doing there in 1941, 42, and recognize that, wow, there were Italians on the Eastern Front, maybe. And the fact that they're operating in Donbass, in places that you see coming up in the news is kind of thought-provoking as well.
Yeah, no, very, very much so. And I think also the I don't want to go down this rabbit hole too much, but the acceptance of the way the Italians managed, shall we say, the Yugoslavian Balkans front, the way they were in the Mediterranean, the way they were in the Eastern Front, obviously some broad similarities, but also stark differences where you can kind of see when you look at for example, the Japanese, the Pacific, they kind of stamp their way around that world in very broadly similar ways. It's all, whereas the Italians are seeming to be they're fitting the campaign to the purpose of the campaign, or they're attempting to, perhaps. And with the Eastern Front, as you made out, it's about keeping on Hitler's side and doing what he wants to do, but also trying to retain some kind of independence there because they've got parallel and overlapping but slightly separate aims. It is complicated, and I think its complication is why we don't. It's very easy to just talk in horrible terms about the brutality of the Einsatz group, and for example, and just say, okay, they were murdering ourselves doing this, and you can understand it on very simple terms because it is a very simple, racially hateful policy. But the Italians, there's more levels to it that make it interesting, I think.
Yeah, it is complicated, right? And it's not. So I'm not trying to say that that the Italian behavior on the Eastern Front was exactly the same as what the Germans were doing, right? There are differences, and we need to look at the complex and overlapping reasons for those differences.
Yeah, why were they different, and how are they similar? How they were different? Well, I'm definitely going to extend an invitation for you to come back and explore this, because the whole idea of how propaganda is used within the Italian military is something that I find really interesting. So we'll extend an invitation of that in the future. But in the meantime, folks, we're back again tomorrow. Nina's coming back on to talk. She was on a couple of years ago talking about remembrance and burials after the Ardennes, and now we're looking at the way Luxembourg soldiers fought with the Third Reich. So that'll be an interesting one. And then we have other shows coming this way. Paul Latowski is on Friday talking about operational problems in Normandy. We got the first, that's on Thursday, the first of our two-parter looking at Bomber Command. I'm looking forward to that. So as always, click like and subscribe, buy my guest books, visit their websites, read their blogs, go to their conferences, attend their lectures, so they will create more content for us to chow down on. So thank you, Nicolas. Thank you, viewers. This is Paul Dutch from World War II TV saying I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.